Hello, everyone. Welcome from Microsoft. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today. And we are going to do a webcast on getting started with Microsoft Graph SDK from JavaScript apps. So with no further delay, I'm going to request Sydney to come join us for the webinar. With that said, the last thing I want to call out is if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat window and then we will answer it for you. Welcome, Sydney.
Thank you so much for that warm introduction. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the last part in a really interesting series on developing JavaScript applications with the Microsoft Identity Platform. Today, we are going to explore the Graph SDK for JavaScript, which is normally pretty tough to talk about because there's a lot of prerequisites, like understanding how MSAL.js works and how you want to build your application. Well, today, this is the last part of a multi-part series. So a lot of those prerequisites we talked about in previous videos. We set up MSAL.js, we set up in a Node application, we set it up client side in the browser, and we're going to use all that knowledge that we've gained to use the Graph SDK and make queries to the graph. And even today, we'll try a couple examples where we're manipulating the graph itself. So I'd like to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. I'm Sydney Andrews. Once again, I'm an Azure MVP, Microsoft Certified Trainer. This is the fourth part in a four-part series. All of the previous videos in the series is on our YouTube channel, Microsoft Dev Radio on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to that channel as you can see all the recordings for all the episodes in the series. We're gonna have a Q&A, so please feel free put questions in the Q&A. I'm gonna try and answer them today. Since we're doing a very code-heavy demo, I'm going to jump in and work on the code, and then at the end of today's session, I'm going to try and answer as many questions as possible for the Q&A. However, I'm only human. I may get the wrong answer to a question, or you may have a follow-up question, or I might miss your question altogether. If you have any questions or need further help with this series, msusdev at Microsoft.com. Once again, that's msusdev at Microsoft.com. That's our alias and email address. Please feel free to reach out. Hit us up if you want to ask questions, get feedback. We definitely have gotten all of the above. As a matter of fact, we got people reach out and say, hey, I want to see this series in this programming language. So it's pretty cool stuff. All the demos and source code for all four parts of the series are already available online, github.com/msusdev, Microsoft Identity Platform Dev. That's our repo. You can go there. You can see the show notes for all four episodes in the series, including today's show notes for the demos I'm going to show today. This is the fourth part in a four-part series. We started with session 1, where we authenticated users using MSAL.js directly in JavaScript apps. In the second part, we used the Microsoft Graph Toolkit so that we didn't have to write manual MSAL code. In the third part of the series, we did use the MSAL.js library again to authenticate to Azure services. So today, we've used Microsoft Graph in plenty of past sessions, but today we're going to take the Microsoft Graph and use the wonderful Graph SDK, which makes it really easy to create a graph, and use our knowledge of MSAL.js to set up authentication for the Graph SDK. So 3 things we're going to try to accomplish today. It's going to be very code heavy. I'm going to show you how to set up the Graph SDK. We're going to pull an example for earlier in the series. So I'm going to walk back through that a little bit. We're going to query your user profile, and then we're going to go to Microsoft To Do and create and manage your to-do task list. And you'll see how we do all that using the Graph Explorer and the Graph SDK. Both the process of getting something from a to-do list, putting something to a to-do list. It's going to be a lot of fun. That's a really good example to help you understand how to use the Graph SDK. So I'm just going to go ahead and just jump into the code. So I'm going to exit out of PowerPoint now. On my machine, I have Windows Terminal running. I'm going to zoom in on everything a little bit so you can see it better. I have Visual Studio Code, and then I have a browser open with the Azure portal. I'm going to go into the Azure portal and go to Azure Active Directory. And I'm going to create a brand new application registration. And I'm going to call this application registration MSUSDev Graph. Now, the account types I'm going to use for this application registration, I could choose any of these options, but I'm going to keep it simple today. Only accounts in my organization. So this is going to be a single tenant app, as opposed to a multi-tenant app that can use accounts from any Azure Active Directory organization, or accounts that can use a combination of organizational accounts, or I can authenticate using a combination of organizational accounts or personal Microsoft accounts, are set up for personal Microsoft accounts only. But today, we're going to keep it super simple, just my org. And then I'm going to create a redirect URI. So we've been building single page applications for the majority of demos in this series. So I'm going to set one up for a single page application. We use HTTP localhost 8080. And then once I'm done, I'm going to hit, excuse me, I'm going to hit register here. And I've created an application that we're going to use for our demos. Now, throughout this series, we use a combination of sample applications. So I'm going to go github.com msusdev. One of the sample applications we used was the example static JS app. Now, this example static JS app is just a vanilla JavaScript application. It has two branches. The main branch is the starter code that I used in the first session in this series. And the example branch has the code that was the conclusion of first session in the series. And I know somebody might jump in the Q&A and say, hey, I haven't seen the first session. We have a YouTube recording of our first session where I'll walk through that code. I'm going to walk through it today. So we're going to clone this repo. So I'm going to just go ahead and grab the URI to clone it. I'm going to go to my Windows terminal, git clone, I'm going to paste in that URI, and now I'm going to clone into my current directory. So using a dot, hit enter, clone my GitHub repo, and I'm going to open that folder within my Visual Studio Code instance. Now, this is the main branch. This is a really simple application. It uses HTTP server to serve the content. It uses index.html file using Bootstrap here. We have a button called run code, and then we use the console to see what happens. It has a single JavaScript file, index.js, and right now, when you click the button, it runs this function called run. We'll zoom it just one more time, and all it does is writes running to the console. So if I start this now, so npm start. Oh, I forgot to run npm install. I'm so glad I made that mistake. When you pull this code down yourself, you're definitely going to run npm install to bring in all your dependencies. Then once npm install is done, npm start. Starting my server. Then I'm going to go to my browser. I'm going to just go localhost 8080. And there's my application. Can hit F12. There's my console. If I hit run code, make sure I got everything right. Actually, let me control F5. I was testing this code out earlier. Hit run code, and it prints out running. So there we go. Application does absolutely nothing, but it does it spectacularly. All right, going back to Visual Studio Code, we are going to switch branches. So right now we have some changes. I'm just going to ignore them. I'm going to discard these changes. This is just package lock.json file. I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to go in and pull my example branch, the one I just told you about. This changes a couple things. First, in the index.html file, we'll just jump to that. This adds a single JavaScript file called MSAL browser min.js using unpackage.com. If you're not familiar with unpackage.com, unpackage.com is a CDN that allows you to use npm packages directly in a script. So for example, if I wanted to use at Azure/identity, unpackage will allow me to browse it on a browser or use it directly within a script file. So here we're Azure MSAL browser. And again, I'll go way deeper into this in the first session. We have our Azure MSAL browser, and we see that allows us to get this CDN content. Now we can always go in and browse folders here. So we can browse the folders, see what's available, the TypeScript files, the JavaScript files, all sorts of cool stuff. And we're gonna, we're gonna keep this handy in case we need it a little bit later. So today we're using from the distribution folder, index.js file. And we know that because we can go to Visual Studio Code, or actually it's the lib folder, not distribution folder, I apologize. lib/msal browser min.js. That's the only change to the index.html file. You can always compare branches if you want to see it yourself. Then in our application code, again, for those who are here for the first session, you may say, hey, you're repeating yourself. It's okay. Just walking it through in case anybody missed it. We create a config object. We have our client ID and authority. I'm going to change those since we have a new application registration. So for authority instead of organizations, which for those who remember, that's shorthand for any Azure AD org, I'm going to just put in the GUID of my organization. Now, when somebody tries to log in, they have to log in using my organization. The client ID, I'm just going to copy the client ID from my application registration. So I do that. And the redirect URL is already set to localhost 8080. Perfect. We create a new public client application for MSAL, since this is going to be an interactive login. We set our scopes to user.read, and we request, we do a login pop-up. Then we acquire a token silently, since we're already logged in using the same scopes and account from the previous request. Then we go to the graph, graph.microsoft.com, version 1.0/me. Using our access token, we get my profile and print it to the console. So if I got this all right, I shouldn't have to change any code. I should just go in here, Control F5, hit run code. It's going to say, hey, it's time to log in. I'm going to log in using my account. It says, okay, MS US Dev Graph. You need to, it's not published by Microsoft, but you need to give it permissions to sign and reach your profile. Sure. I hit accept. There's my login response, my token response, which includes my access token, and then the graph response, which includes my profile from the Microsoft Graph. Wonderful. Everything works perfectly. Now, if we want to take this and we used fetch, and we did everything very, very manual, but we could take it a step further and use the Graph SDK. Now, that's on npm using npm.js.com. Microsoft Graph Client. That's the name of the npm package for the Microsoft Graph JavaScript SDK. And we're going to use that. And there's a couple different ways. We can pull it in via npm, or we can add it in a script tag. And I just taught you how to use unpackage. So using unpackage, we can go to unpackage.com/browse at Microsoft. And you see I've done this a couple times, Microsoft Graph Client. It's going to take us to the latest version. Let's see, Microsoft Graph Client. Make sure I didn't spell anything wrong. The lib folder. There we go. I forgot the trailing slash. So this takes us to the lib folder, Microsoft Graph Client. I forgot the trailing slashes. That's why I couldn't find anything. So from here, there's a couple things I'm interested in. If I want to pull in a Graph SDK, I'll just need to go to lib and pull in Graph.js, SDK.js. This is going to be the Microsoft Graph SDK. So I'm going to hit view raw. This is going to give me the actual, let me make sure I hit the right button here. Refresh this one time. All right, I'm going to grab this raw URI and add to index.html a script tag. Script source. I'm going to paste in that raw URI, cross origin, and close my script tab. Now that's going to give me the Graph SDK. Now, one of the cool things about the Graph SDK is if you look it up, you'll see that there's a couple different ways to authenticate. And one of the ways they support authentication is using a MSAL browser authentication provider. So we saw that just a second ago. If I hit lib, we saw there's a second, I don't know why it's asking me to translate, but we saw earlier it had a Graph Client MSAL browser auth provider. That sounds perfect because we're using the MSAL browser library. It's going to hit view raw here, get this JavaScript file, paste this into my HTML file. And for those who are following along, remember, every single thing I'm typing in here is on GitHub, on our repo, so you can follow along yourself. All right, let me make sure I have the right amount of text. Everything looks good. If I have a typo, we'll find out a little bit later. All right, if we go back to our index.js file, we correctly set up our MSAL public client application. But now that we're using Graph SDK, here's the beautiful thing. We can go in, delete everything else. So we set up our MSAL public client application. And from there, we can set up a graph client. So first off, we need an options object. So options. I apologize. I'm using I'm on the road this week, so I'm using my cell phone for my show notes. I'm using the same GitHub repo that everyone else is using. So just, a heads up, that kind of makes things a little bit easier. So we're going to create a new options object. We use auth provider. And scopes, it's the user.read, interaction type, MSAL.interactive type .popup. I believe it's, can't remember, it's pop-up? Yeah, pop-up. Okay. Now that we have our options, we could just say var graph client equals, and this is where we go Microsoft Graph .client .init with middleware, passing in our options. So let me just make sure I didn't get any typos here. Go into our application, Control F5, hit run code. All right, it says pop-up is undefined, so let me make sure I have everything typed in here. It's MSAL interaction type pop-up. So graph client, lib graph.js SDK JS. And I'm just double checking all my code here. Auth provider.js, go to my options, auth provider, interaction type, MSAL interaction type. I don't see anything obviously wrong. So let me show you what I would do if I wasn't sure what was going on. I can take this Microsoft Graph client, and go to its page on GitHub, to the Microsoft Graph client for JavaScript. Here we go. Here's this GitHub repo. And I could go look at the notes for how to set it up. So there's a getting started section, how to register within the Azure portal. And then there's a section called creating your client instance. Now, when you create your client instance, you can set it up to use the Azure Identity Library that we use in the third session, where you build your own custom token credential, or you can use the MSAL browser authentication provider. So I'm going to click on this, and it walks you through an example of how to do this. So here, you pull in your script files, and then using a CDN script, it says you need to create a new MS Graph offcode MSAL browser provider using MSAL client. And it looks like I missed the entirety of that. So instead of sitting here trying to guess what we need to do correctly, I'm going to just go in and copy this so I don't get it wrong. So just going back, our options equals new authentication provider using client, scope still user.read. That looks correct. Let me check my typo here. It says for the here MSAL interaction type pop-up. Let me make sure I used lowercase I interaction type. So I had it wrong. Okay. So I fixed my typos and showed you where to find the documentation in case you make typos like I do. There we go. It says running, but you notice nothing has happened. That's because the Graph SDK doesn't actually perform login until you make your first request to the graph. So using that same documentation page, if I wanted to learn how to make my first request, I just go back to that getting started page, and it says, okay, for your first request, call await client.api, give it a path. For us, we use the me path in our first example, and then issue a get request. Okay, let's try that out. So we have a graph client. We're going to say let profile equals await graph client dot API. We're going to the me path. We're going to get this request, and then we're going to console.dir my profile information. So if I got this right, fingers crossed, no typos this time. Control F5, hit run code. All right, it says I need an account object. If I go back to my documentation, we'll create client instance. It does need an account object that I left out. No problem. And I'm gonna have to update my show notes because I left this out. I apologize for those who are probably looking at the show notes like, that's not in the show notes. Oh, there's my account object. Run code. And there we go. There's my profile information from the graph. So I was able to use the Graph SDK instead of using fetch. And that opens up a whole world of possibilities. So I want to show you one of the really cool ways we can use the Graph SDK. So I'm going to go to aka.ms/ge. That's the Microsoft Graph Explorer. Once again, that's aka.ms/ge, or short for Graph Explorer. And I know using the Graph SDK version 1.0, if I go to me endpoint and run that query, it gives me a JavaScript object for my profile. Easy peasy. But what if I wanted to do something a little bit more complex? So let's say I wanted to go to Microsoft To Do and get a list of all of my to-do lists. So the way Microsoft To Do works is you have to-do lists, and each to-do list has to-do actions. Now it says in order to use the queries here, we should use the task.read-write permission. If I go in and run this query, I'll see that I have two to-do lists. One's called task, one's called demo. So how do we get here? Me/to-do/list. So going back, it's me/to-do/list. I'll rename this variable to list so I know what it is. Console.dir to print it out. So I'm going to go to the graph me/to-do/list. Now you're probably already saying, hey, I see a mistake you're making. Let's make this mistake together. It's going to hit Control F5, going to hit run code, and it says, uh-oh, access is denied. You don't have enough permission. Well, if we go back to our code, we'll see that we have permissions to user.read. But according to the Graph Explorer, we need permission to task.read-write in order to read a to-do list. So let's go back to our code and add task.read-write, save it, refresh our application, hit run code. Notice we have a pop-up. I'm going to log in, and it says, okay, permissions have been updated. We also need to read, update, delete your tasks and task list. Do I give it permission? Absolutely. Hit accept. There's my object array with two values. One is my demo list, one is my task list. Awesome. We can keep it going. Like, for instance, if we wanted to create, I'm going to zoom out a little bit so you can see this. If we want to create a new to-do list, it looks like we go to the me to-do list endpoint. Instead of a get, it's a post. And we need to pass in a JSON body with a display name. So I'm going to say list created for webinar, for this awesome webinar. So we go to the same endpoint, but instead of a get, we do a post. Run that query, and we create a brand new list. If we go to get to do task list, run that query, we'll have, just give it a second to run. There we go. We have three lists: task, demo, and list created for this awesome webinar. So let's try it. Let's go into Visual Studio Code. I'm going to leave that list query down there, but I'm going to say this: let new list equals display name created by a computer. Then I'm going to call await graph client.api me to do list dot post new list. And make sure, checking my show notes, make sure I didn't get any typos. I had 2 typos so far. All right. Gonna save, but get this right. We're gonna create a new list and then query it. So hit Control F5 to refresh my browser. Hit run code. We have a new array of 4 lists. List created for this awesome webinar, demo, created by a computer, and tasks. If I go to the Graph Explorer, run this query again, hit run query, I'll see we have tasks and created by a computer. So we're able to use code to manipulate the graph. We just created a new list in Microsoft To Do using JavaScript code. We can create a task on a list. So one of the cool things is a lot of these URIs are relative. So we have me/to-do/list. If we click create to-do task, it looks like the way we do this is we go to me to-do list, pass in an ID for our task list, and go to the task endpoint. The task object has a title property. So if I wanted to put a task in this list, I need to do a couple things. One is I need to get the unique identifier for this new list I created. So we're going to go back, and I think I have this within the browser. So created by a computer, there's this unique identifier. I'm going to copy the string contents. That's my unique identifier from this task list. I'm going to paste this in here, and I'm going to create a task for Microsoft Graph Explorer. So hit run query, it's post to this endpoint, and it created a brand new task called task created for Microsoft Graph Explorer. It works the other way. If I hit get, and I don't need a request body for get, and run that query, it'll get all the tasks in this list, which right now is only one, task created for Microsoft Graph Explorer. So using that information, we can do some cool things. So go in here, I can say, all right, I am going to create a new task with a title. I will answer Q&A questions after this demo with a smiley face. Instead of going to me to-do list, remember, we're going to endpoint me to-do list, our unique task ID /task. So let me create a variable task ID, pass in that unique task ID, do some wonderful string concatenation. So we can create a new task. And then if I get this right, we should be able to call a get to that same endpoint to get the task. So let me walk you through what I'm doing. I save my unique task ID here. I created a new task. I'll answer Q&A questions after this demo. I'm calling the API me/to-do/list, unique task ID /task. Okay, wonderful. And then I'm going to post this new task, not new list. This is why I love walking through code. Then I'm going to create a variable called task and dir that out. I get this by calling me/to-do/list, my unique task ID /task, and issuing a get request. So I'm going to go in, fingers crossed, I have no typos. Hit run code. There's my task list with two tasks. One is called task created for Microsoft Graph Explorer. The other one's called I will answer Q&A questions after this demo. So let's tie this all together. This is where I get really nervous about typos, but I think we could do this. All right, so we are going to say let new list equals, and this one has a display name, final list. All right, let wait graph, to make sure I have no typos here. Wait graph client dot API me to do list dot post my new list. Now, when I post that, it's going to create a new list object. So let's save that in a variable. Let created list equals the result of this, and then we're going to console out dir created list. All right, going back to the browser, Control F5, and I'm showing you to-do list because that's one of the simplest objects to process. But you're going to see in a second, you can do this with pretty much any thing on the graph. So you hit run code. There's our object. It has an ID, well-known list name, also a display name, all sorts of wonderful things, and it returns an ID, so we can use that information. So our last list, really this time, we're going to have a new list object, display name. Matter of fact, I'll keep it even simpler. I'll just push this in here. A new variable called new list, console.log, and then we could do that, or I'll just console that there, that's fine. That's our new list. Then we're going to add a task to that list. So let new task equals await graph client dot API me to do list plus new list dot ID task dot post. You know, I don't need to store this in a variable called new task. I'll just post the task. Title, this is really a new task. And then my final request will be let task equals await graph client dot API. We'll just copy this because that's just same endpoint, but this time we're issuing a GET request in console.dir task. So we printed. So let's walk through what we have. We have our graph client. We create a new list with a display name, actually our last list, really this time, to the endpoint me to-do list. We are going to the API. We're creating a new task by going to that list/list.d, very RESTful API here, notice, /task endpoint, and we're posting a JSON object with a title for our new task. This is a really new task. And then we're going to wrap everything up by just printing out all the tasks for our new list. So if I got this right, fingers crossed, Control F5, run code. Created list is not defined. Oh, I need the console.dir. New list, not created list. Let's try that one more time. Run code. Resource not found for the segment. Let's see. Let me make sure I got everything right. So our ID is A8MKD. It looks like I concatenated the word list. Let me make sure I didn't have any typos. I do. Forgot my trailing slash. Somebody in the Q&A caught that, I promise you. Control F5. There's our new list called, actually our last list really this time, number 2. It's never really actually the last list. It only has one task. This is really a new task. So if we go to Graph Explorer, get to do task list. We're going to query all of our lists. We'll see that we have task, actually our last list really this time, number 1 and then number 2. If we get that ID and query list / that unique identifier / task, run the query, we'll get all of our tasks in here. This is really a new task. And so what I wanted to show you here is how you can actually create stuff, post to the graph. You can also do patch operations, delete operations, put operations, all sorts of wonderful things. And there's lots of stuff you can do. So for example, I can go in and just, and I'm going to keep this really simple because I don't want to, excuse me. I don't want to like drive this out too much longer, but you can go in, send email using Outlook Mail, whereas you can do a post request using this type of object to me/send mail, and then you, if as long as you have the right permissions, so you go to modify permissions, it says I need mail.send, I can send email. Let's try that out. So I'm gonna send an email to my personal account. So me/send mail, me/send mail, post request, and then the permission I need is mail.send. Let's give it a shot. So and this is fun because this wasn't a demo I planned. I'm just really winging it right now. So let mail equal, that's my mail object. We got our message, subject. Really nervous right now. What is happening? The body. Going to make, sorry. I'm going to make the content text. I'm a little weird about double versus single quotes, so just ignore me, right? Content. How are you today? Let me make sure I got this right. Forgot my comma. 2 recipients. This one's easy. Set a list of email addresses. Email address object has an address property. Here I'll just say msusdev@microsoft.com. Matter of fact, instead of what is happening, this is a test mail. This was sent automatically by our webinar. All right, msusdev@microsoft.com. If you forgot, that's our email address. I'm going to try and answer Q&A questions at the end. If I didn't get to your Q&A question, I didn't give you a satisfactory answer, msusdev@microsoft.com. All right, so using that, what we should have is let sent mail equals await graph client dot API me/send is it send mail or send email? And this is, I'm really doing this like in real time, so super nervous. It's send mail, right? Dot post mail. Okay. So dot dir sent mail. All right. I need to update the permissions, mail.send. That's my mail object. Whew, really nervous. This is a wild last second demo, but I just want to see if it works. Hit run code, fingers crossed. You get a pop-up. Get permission to send mail. Hit accept. Fingers crossed. There we go. It sent an email. So we're able to use the Microsoft Graph to do all sorts of wonderful stuff. The Graph SDK makes it a lot more approachable, a lot simpler. As long as you understand, like, well, get, put, post, your common HTTP operations, you can use a combination of the Microsoft Graph Explorer and then the Graph SDK for JavaScript or any other language to build complex requests and manipulate the graph in lots of really interesting ways. And again, all of our notes are in the show notes. msusdev@microsoft.com is our email address. I'm going to take about 5 minutes here and then our webinar to answer as many questions as I can in the Q&A. So I'm going to have my presentation screen. Just jump in that Q&A. Somebody said MSUSDev Graph on Azure. Somebody said, hey, did we use a web app? No, I just built a really simple browser-based application locally. That's on GitHub, and that's just github.com/msusdev. We have a lot of our sample code there. You can just jump there, msusdev@microsoft.com. If you got any questions, somebody says, hey, the Microsoft Graph, how is this different than a technology like GraphQL? GraphQL as a technology, what it does is it allows you to use a common like syntax for issuing requests to endpoints. I have a really good session on Dev Radio with somebody who's far more experienced with the with GraphQL as a technology. So think of GraphQL as a stack for your APIs. Microsoft Graph itself is just a massive collection of REST APIs and webhooks that you can use to interact with all of the intelligence and data in Microsoft 365. So if you want to send an email, if you want to track Teams meetings, if you want to automatically manage to-do lists, you can use this SDK, the Graph SDK, for a lot of things. A really fun example that I always recommend people to do as their first real example is to go to the Graph Explorer and look at how to retrieve your photo, then use the Graph SDK to update your photo for your Microsoft 365 profile. You'll be doing a put request to that me/photo value endpoint. It's lots of documentation on how to do that, but that's a really good way to get comfortable with the Graph SDK. Couple other questions. Somebody says, let's say we have application registration and we want to set up like maybe a service count or accounts and send email. You can set up application permissions, you can delegate them, you can jump in and let's say you have your Azure AD account and you want to set it up manually through the portal to things like send mail permissions and stuff. You can do that. We go right a lot into this in session 3 around the different ways you can set up permissions. Somebody says, let's say I'm using managed identity. Can I? Is there ways I can do that here? Yes. If you have an application, let's say you have Azure web app and you want it to have access to the graph, but you don't want to pass through your user's permission. You actually want to set up a managed identity and do stuff there. You can absolutely do that. So a really good example of that is I might have a Azure AD application registration and then an Azure web app, and that Azure web app queries all the users in the organization. Now, what I'll do is then go to the Azure AD application registration, and I will go ahead and go to APIs and permissions and set up like permissions for user.read. So just show you what that looks like. I'll go in here and I will, let's zoom out just a little bit. I will go into my application registration. And I have a couple of applications that I've been testing today. MSUSDev Graph, go to API permissions and set up maybe a permission for things like user.read or user.read-write. And then I will go ahead and grant admin consent. And then I can use any type of authentication flow. But just as a fun example, maybe that Azure web app will use credentials for its managed identity, and we flow in so that the application is kind of going in as itself. Because one of the cool things about managed identity is that you could just jump in and treat it like any other Azure AD account. So us for showing is definitely relevant there. All right. So thank you all for staying on and asking really good questions. msusdev@microsoft.com. That's your email if you got any questions after the session is over. All right, just checking. No more Q&A questions. Thank you, everybody, once again.